ready. You're all ready.
We're ready.
Okay, are we live?
We are.
Okay. Okay, I'd like to call to order the July 21st meeting of the Santa Barbara Ordinance Committee. Madam Clerk, may we have a roll call?
Councilmember Jordan.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Snedden.
Here.
Chair Gutierrez.
Present. All right, let the record reflect that we are all present. Ms. Clerk, are there any changes to the agenda?
There are not.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any speaker slips for general public comment that is not on the agenda?
We have one public comment individual, Alan Gallegos. I believe he's going to speak on the item, but I'll check with him. He did put his hand down, so he's one that's going to speak on the item. We currently do not have any public comment that is not on the agenda.
Okay, thank you, Madam Clerk. Would you now please read our first agenda item?
Subject, amending the city's grading ordinance. Recommendation, the Ordinance Committee directs staff to either retain the current grading ordinance or bring ordinance amendments to the City Council for introduction, public hearing, and consideration for adoption.
Okay, thank you. Can we have the staff report now, please? Mr. Stuffler.
Well, good afternoon, Chair Gutierrez and Ordinance Committee members. My name is Andrew Stuffler. I'm the building official and floodplain manager for the city. And today I'm hoping to start a discussion of the grading ordinance, whether it needs to be updated or not. And I just want to start with a little bit of context of what's going on in the building world here in the city. So if it feels like we've been busy and there's a lot of construction going on, that is the case. Each year for the past 5 years, we've issued over 2,500 building permits. We've done over 11,000 building inspections each year. Last year, we were over 14,000. We've fielded more than 250 housing and substandard property investigations each year. And then on top of that, we've had, in the last 10 years, we've had local and state statute changes that have increase the community's expectations for cleaner stormwater on construction sites and after projects are built, and state legislation that has tried to expedite the development of dwellings in the city and make that act a more ministerial act and not have as much public participation in discretionary decisions. The number of enforcement staff and field inspection staff that we've had to do our work over the course of the last 5 years has been low, and we've tried to increase it, and council supported that, and we appreciate it. We're bringing on another building inspector this fiscal year, but they've been low due to absences of staff, long-term absences based on health issues some of the staff have had. So that's made achieving the workload and the expectations of the community even more difficult. I say all this because I want us to understand the dynamics in the building department as we're looking at some of the concerns that are raised. So we've had complaints about grading ordinance enforcement and stormwater pollution prevention enforcement by the Building and Safety Division in the city at 4 particular projects in the city. And those neighbors have made it clear that they're very concerned, and some of their concerns, I think, are warranted. Staff was asked to take a look at solutions, defining the problem and coming up with solutions and proposing those. And that's what we want to start the discussion on today. We found that there were 2 areas of focus that consistently surfaced when we were looking into this. One was quantifying the amount of grading that occurred on a site. How do we do that? Do we do that specifically enough that we could issue administrative citation or a penalty to someone who exceeded the amount of grading that occurred on their site? Or or send them back through another review process because they exceeded a certain amount of grading on their site. But unless we can very assuredly determine how much grading has occurred, it makes it difficult, or if not impossible, for us to issue penalties or send people back through additional processes when we can't definitively determine how much grading has occurred on site. The other was that the penalties for people who did perform grading on their site in excess of the exempted amounts and did not get permits for it, the penalties were pretty low. They were $100 a day. That's sometimes the cost of doing business, unfortunately, for people who are looking at it purely from a business standpoint. So City Council approved and staff recommended and City Council approved increases in those penalties when we adopted the most recent edition of the building code last November. Those penalties are now, instead of $100 a day, they start at $500 a day per violation. And they go up to $1,000 a day depending on the amount of grading that's occurring. So they are very good deterrents, provided that we have the documentation needed to be able to support the illegal grading has occurred. So with that context, I'd like to take you through the presentation today and to look at what we have been doing, some of the outreach that we've done with the community, and then get some feedback on what you think of some of the options that we're proposing. If you think those options should be entertained and brought back to you in the form of amendments to an ordinance, or if you think there's another direction that we should take. Brandon, can you advance the slide? Thank you. So we'll start by talking about what is grading, because I have to say that is oftentimes the most non-intuitive discussion that we have with people who are concerned about grading violations. And then I've kind of explained why the city's considering the grading ordinance updates. So I think that'll be a quick run through on that. And then, like I said, we'll discuss the applicability of the grading ordinance updates when they would go into effect. Next slide. So let's talk about the outreach methods and some options, and then you can give us some direction and we'll take off from there. Next slide, please. So what is grading? Well, technically earthwork, including adding, which would be fills, or removing, which are excavations of earth, not in a public roadway. And here's the part that I think is most confusing and not intuitive for neighbors. Grading and the need for a grading permit when we're looking at quantities of earth being moved, we do not include the excavation for a building that's going to go in to a hillside or anywhere else, and where the foundation has to be placed below the earth. So there are at least three of the four most problematic grading projects that we've had in the city recently, where the excavations for the buildings were pretty big, very large. So the neighbors are watching roll-offs leave the site with earth in them, thinking, hey, that's way more than 50 cubic yards. This should have had a grading permit and maybe had some additional public discretionary or some discretionary review that which brought public comment, and they didn't get a chance for that. So trying to help people understand that the excavation of the earth in a hillside to place a building into it, like a basement or a daylight basement or a foundation, is not part of the cubic yards for grading. And that is a common practice. This ordinance that we have right now is modeled after the Los Angeles County ordinance, which many of the local grading ordinances around Southern California are modeled after. And it does not, it's exactly like this. So if you're excavating for a foundation, you don't need to include that excavation in your grading quantities. And that's because there's an assumption that a building's going there and the building is going to be engineered to withstand whatever cuts are made. So that's kind of not very intuitive, and that leads a lot of people to believe that builders are violating grading ordinance when they may not be. Next slide, please. Obviously, grading is important. Why? Well, we want to protect property. We want to mitigate the potential hazards of property damage, slope failures, even nuisance water discharges, rainwater and otherwise from properties uphill or upstream. We definitely have a commitment and a desire to make sure that our stormwater pollution is eliminated or greatly minimized to the extent that it's not visible. And we struggle with that. And that's something that we struggle with during construction as well as post-construction. And then from a floodplain management standpoint, obviously, we don't want to allow grading that's going to have a detrimental effect on our floodplains. Next slide, please. So why are we considering the updates? Well, I touched on this. For many decades, we have had a rule of, we call it the 50 cubic yard rule. It's actually more complicated than that. It's 20 cubic yards if you're making a deeper, doing some deeper fill, but it's 20 to 50 cubic yards and 50 cubic yards if you're making a cut into a hillside or something for other than a building. And no public hearing is required. It's a ministerial permit. Usually a civil engineer prepares the plans. And that plan has specific requirements in our grading ordinance. It's had those requirements for decades. And we issue the permit and the work commences, and then they call for inspections. But concerns about grading have increased, and especially these 4 sites that in the last 2 years that we've heard a lot about. And they're in the hillside areas. They're in neighborhoods where the runoff from one property to another is very critical, and you want to make sure it's managed properly. So, consequently, those neighbors desire additional verification. They really are concerned, and they want to make sure that their interests and the interests of the general community are being looked out for. Next slide, please. So that makes us ask the question, are the updates that we are proposing or for consideration and discussion, are they necessary for all of the city? I can say, based on the complaints that we received, all of the complaints have been in one district, one city council member's district that I've heard of and that I can recall. And if there are others, please bring them to my attention. But the 4 major ones are in the Hillside District. But that may not mean, there may be good reason to make amendments to the ordinance for the entire city or certain portions of the city. But I think it's important to note that those are the ones that we've heard about. And then we need to ask ourselves, based on what we're hearing as far as issues and concerns, what is there evidence of damage, property damage, slope failures, those things that we were trying to mitigate. Next slide, please. So our stakeholder outreach, we mailed out more than 100 letters and emails, and we have attached to the staff report the list of stakeholders that we directed our outreach to. We did conduct a virtual go-to webinar meeting on June 30th, and there were 11 attendees on that. And then we recorded that and made that available for other people to view after the meeting. Next slide, please. As of today, we have 9 responses to the surveymonkey.com survey, which is very, very quick. It's averaged 5 minutes per survey surveyed person. And if you look on the handouts tab here in go to webinar, and you click on the triangle next to the handouts tab, you'll see there are 2 documents, 2 PDFs there. So one of those is the grading ordinance survey responses as of 10 o'clock this morning, 10 or 10:30 this morning. And the other are a list of the emails that I received, because we did ask for people to send us emails if they wanted to provide feedback. And I wanted to make those available to the Ordinance Committee to be able to see in the public so they can see what conversations are happening and what survey responses we're receiving as part of our stakeholder outreach. Next slide, please. So we put together the 3 options, actually 2 options and one that we're currently doing, we've been doing for the last several decades. The option of having a private special inspector on site to take measurements and keep track of the grading that happens each day. That way a cut and a fill in the same day can be added together, because those two activities add together and contribute to the 50 cubic yards, or 20, depending on whether it's all fill. Another option, if a city council feels that that's too onerous to have someone on site to do that, it's a digital survey, possibly before and after, or before, during, and after the grading operations begin and conclude. Drones, there's some very good technology right now, very reliable technology that allows drones to make digital surveys, topographical surveys. It has an expense to it. It's not free, so it has a cost. But that's an option if that's something we think we want to have our community or our developers or property owners in our community invest in order for the benefit of the larger community. Or we could continue to use the licensed civil engineer or surveyor's verification at the close of rough grading or finished grading, if it's just a grading operation. And that is our status quo. That's what we've relied on when there's a discrepancy on the grading. We'll ask the civil engineer of record to tell us, to quantify how much grading occurred on site. And then there are other options, but these were three discussion points that we thought we could bring forward for Ordinance Committee to consider and give us some feedback on. Next slide, please. So moving forward, we're looking for direction from the Ordinance Committee. If the Ordinance Committee finds that our ordinance that we have right now is satisfactory and the enforcement of that ordinance needs to be beefed up, then that direction could be given, and we would no longer pursue an ordinance amendment. We would need to solve how we quantify grading in order to facilitate the enforcement and hold people accountable, have good evidence. Or we could have the Ordinance Committee recommend that we do some further study and come back with an ordinance with some amendments. And if that's the case, then we have tentatively set September 22nd and September 29th as City Council hearing and adoption dates, or introduction, I should say, and adoption dates. And should that go through, the very soonest that we would have an effective date for amended grading ordinance would be the end of October. Next slide, please. I provided this slide. It was from our GoToWebinar, but this is more for the public. And of course, anybody who would like to participate in the survey can. It's very quick. And City Council members and Ordinance Committee members can go to this survey. Don't have to participate in it necessarily. You can just go to see what the questions were. They're very, very quick questions. The first one is help us understand which City Council districts you own property or businesses in, so we can kind of get a feel for what their perspective is on the problem of grading. And then we ask them about the reasonableness and what they would recommend in the way of these three options, or other, if they have another option they'd like us to consider. And of course, information can always be mailed to us. We would like that US mailed correspondence to be directed at our grading ordinance update so it doesn't get lost with other mail that we receive. Next slide, please. And that's staff's presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Stuffler. I appreciate that. At this time, I'd like to open the floor up to my colleagues if they have any questions. Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon.
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez. Thank you, Mr. Stuffler, and for taking this seriously and looking through the various options and presenting them to us. I really appreciate that on behalf of District 4, which you mentioned. Most of these issues are in one particular district, and it is the hillside of District 4. And I do represent that district, so I want to say that out front, that it is skewed toward one district, but that one district is our entire Riviera, so it counts. So I want to have some question about, so you talked about grading, and then you talked about foundation excavation. Could you talk a little bit about rubble? How do you distinguish, especially in the hillside where almost everything is from a debris flow and there's large boulders in it or small rocks? how do you define rubble as different from grading?
So thank you. Good question. Rubble, which could be mixed in with the earth that was graded in a roll-off. And from our definition, rubble is construction elements of a building that have been, or structure that have been taken apart. So it could be a concrete patio. It could be concrete stairs or cut stone stairways that were going up a hillside. Usually it's pretty substantial because it's not something they're putting in a trash can or moving to another part of the yard. They're taking it away. So, but there should be mixed in with that, the soil, there should be obvious construction materials that have been demolished. And that's a standard that Marburg uses. And fortunately with Marburg, we can call them and we can ask them by site how they classified each dumpster of each roll-off of grading earth that came to them, whether it was good soil, whether it was contaminated, whether it had rubble in it. So that helps us to do some of our enforcement.
So do they, as a practice, roll off individual portions of rubble versus soil? It's not mixed together?
There's no regulation. There's nothing that prohibits someone from mixing their rubble and their soil in their roll-off. Marburg will, I can't remember if they charge differently, but they do classify each roll-off as either clean soil, or if it has any rubble at all in it, they call it rubble. Doesn't, and there's 10 yards in each roll-off. So that has a large margin of error to it.
So I want to set that aside as something to talk about. If it has any rubble at all, then it's classified as rubble. So then that wouldn't count towards your 50 cubic yards.
Well, that's a good,
is that correct?
That's a really good point. So that actually isn't the case. The earth does count, but it makes it really difficult for us to try to figure out how much earth was moved, because if Marburg would say there was 10% rubble in that 10-yard roll-off, we can do the math. But if they say, yeah, there was some rubble in there, so we called all 10 yards rubble, I don't know how much soil was moved, because they didn't give me that breakdown, and the soil's gone. And so then all I can do is ask the licensed engineer of record what happened, how much earth was moved. And that's happened on one of these properties. And it came, ultimately the decision comes down to, do you believe the licensed civil engineer or not? Which is, we want to believe them, but they too cannot quantify specifically what was in each roll-off.
I want to make it very clear at the outset that I believe civil engineers. I'm married to one. I myself have the background. Like I'm in no way questioning civil engineers and their ability to count dirt. It's not a trust issue. It's the definitions of how things are defined. And as you mentioned, these 4 that have been problematic. I also don't want to regulate the heck out of the whole city to try and address these issues of these 4. So I do trust and believe civil engineers, and I know that there's a lot riding on a stamp. So it's not, I know that engineers don't go around just stamping anything. But in this quantifying, I guess that's where I'm asking the questions about the details of how did these projects, these 4 in particular, go so wrong in my mind and in the neighbor's mind with that 50 cubic yards. And I've seen plans that come in at 49 cubic yards or 49.5. And as you rightly state, it's very difficult to quantify down to that level. If Marburg can say, oh, it's 10%, and I'm not sure what the other percent is, and a civil engineer, if they aren't, as you say, onerously tracking daily what the separation of dirt is, then that 50 cubic yards becomes a hard line, but it can be easily, there's a large margin of error that could be introduced there. And I think that's what I'm hoping to address also, but for questions first, I guess. And I'm happy with some of the options that are presented, but I think maybe we could look at some other options as well. So the 50 cubic yard threshold is what it is now. And what happens if it's above the 50 cubic yards? It goes to single family design?
Yes, if it's a single family home where the property's currently or it's zoned for single family, then it would go to the single family design review board.
Okay. And
Ju-
then, and that board, what would be in their jurisdiction to consider when they were looking at something that had over 50 cubic yards of grading?
That's a really good question. I am not a single family design review board expert, but I kind of don't want to speculate. What they do. I can get back to you with that, but I know it has to do with, you know, the mass, the scale, you know, more the architectural features, and how that's going to work. And then they look practically at site drainage and those things to make sure they're not approving an architectural design that's going to have detrimental effects.
Okay, and I guess that's what I was getting at, is the drainage. Like they look more closely and in detail and need approvals on drainage changes or other. Okay. So I guess too, if you could just describe a little bit. I mean, 50 cubic yards matters more when you alluded to it on a hillside, and the steeper the hillside, the more that 50 cubic yards will have an impact on affecting drainages or different changes. What percent grading? Like right now, the hillside district is at 14% slope, or at what percent slope is the difference in the hillside? I believe it's 14%.
That's a zoning regulated function, and I don't know the percentage.
Okay. But could you describe a little bit the difference between 50 cubic yards in the flat part of downtown versus 50 cubic yards on a hillside, the difference that would make?
So to visualize, 50 cubic yards is about the size of a conventional school bus.
Okay.
So if you were adding that to a flat 5 to 10,000 acre parcel, it would change the elevation quite a bit, but you could blend it at the perimeters of the property, and you could manage your stormwater runoff probably pretty effectively. It's a lot of earth, but not a whole lot of earth compared to 50 cubic yards on a hillside, and the extent of drainage impacts that you would probably encounter trying to distribute that 50 cubic yards without creating a nuisance.
Okay. And then, so say it does create a nuisance. Say you're under 50 cubic yards or at 49.9, and it does create a nuisance because of how it was graded. What course of appeal or action does a neighbor have if that's the case?
Yes, so the way our grading ordinance is set up, even if you're exempt from a grading permit, you still have to comply with all the ordinance requirements. And two of the requirements in the ordinance are compliance with stormwater runoff during construction, and another one is after post-construction, it has to function in accordance with the National Pollution Elimination Discharge, which is essentially our stormwater permit. So you do have to manage your drainage regardless of how much grading you do, even if you don't need a permit, and you do have to manage your stormwater discharge regardless of how much grading you do.
And is that stormwater discharge just if it goes into a creek, or is it if it, sheet flows across somebody's property?
Both, but different reasons. So every property owner has the right to and the obligation to manage their stormwater and not change the course or volume of it coming onto or leaving their property without going through the proper permitting channels or the proper civil engineering practices. You can't create a nuisance for your downhill neighbor, and your uphill neighbor can't cut off your water to you if you have a water feature on your property. In general, Ariel could probably give us some more specific guidance on that. But that's how you have to manage your stormwater runoff either way here.
So let me just ask you one more question about that too. So if prior to grading or making changes there, the water runoff is sort of dispersed and doesn't funnel into one particular zone, and then there are changes, and now suddenly, I mean, this happens all the time, suddenly the downhill neighbor is getting a funneled but concentration of flow, and it's spouting down onto their property, and they're not happy with it, but it was under 50 cubic yards. what happens then?
Then they can call us and we'll go out and do an assessment to try to determine what earth was moved, or we'll probably look more practically at what drainage course has changed. And then we'll require the uphill property owner to make amends to restore the drainage to what it was, or to come to an agreement with their downhill neighbors on how they want to manage that drainage. And we've had that actually out on the mesa a couple times, smaller scale, right? But construction's going on, someone's doing work, and then no one notices it until the next big rain. So it could be 9 months later, right? Big rain comes and it's like, wow, we never had our patio, full of silt. And now it is. And so we're called out to take a look at it.
And so it's, even if it's under 50 cubic yards, you cannot change the drainage. Okay. And it's not necessarily if it goes into a creek. Yeah.
You can change the drainage, but you cannot change it to the detriment of your uphill or downhill neighbor.
And is that determined if they complain, or, yeah?
No, so Chair Gutierrez, Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon, the common law relating to floodwater says that you can't unreasonably alter the drainage course so as to negatively impact the downhill owners. So the downstream property owners have a cause of action, private cause of action, in addition to city regulations, if an uphill owner with or without city permission alters a drainage course to their unreasonable detriment.
Thank you.
And I believe that's without regard to quantity of material being moved.
Okay. And then how much, in your experience, what is the range of how much it costs to have a digital, or private citizen to have a digital survey for before and after? You said it was considerable expense, but do you have an idea of how much?
Yeah, so I talked with a firm called Skyladder last week, and just to get a ballpark, and they said that the starting rate was about $1,000 to $1,500, and then if they have to come out interim periods of time, was another like $500 to $1,000 per trip.
So it'd be $1,500 at the start and then $1,500 at the end?
If I understood them correctly, it would be $1,500 at the most at the start and $1,000 at the most at the end when they come out to do the final.
Okay. So for $2,500 approximately, that they could give you a digital topographic map or accounting for,
yeah,
but not necessarily what the material was, just the difference in topography. Okay.
Right, and if there was an over excavation and then a backfill of the material, it wouldn't account for that because it's just going with a net.
Got it. And then just one more question at this point. So cut and fill, do they zero each other out, or is it 50 cubic yards that have been moved total?
Yes,
okay.
The latter.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon. Councilmember Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hey, Mr. Steffler. So I want to make sure I understand the footprint for grading. And so if I'm doing permanent flat work on the property, but I need to grade for that, that grading would count towards the 50 cubic yards. It's just the walls of the building underneath that don't count?
Technically, yes.
But in an application setting?
Yeah, flat work for a single family home, unless it's a driveway, doesn't require a building permit. And if you have a large site, you could do a lot of flat work.
Right.
And you could export and import a lot of material in if you had poor soils and you didn't want your patio slabs to crack or what have you. So, but as a rule, that's correct.
Yeah, but in particular too, if you want to do a lot of flat work in a hillside district, you'd be talking a lot of cut to level off particular areas that might not be there already, right?
I would assume that, yes.
And that in theory, that would count towards your 50 cubic yards, right?
Yes.
Okay. And then do we currently not have, I'm assuming we have a site inspection when forms are done for foundations, right?
Yes.
Prior to pouring?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so we do not have a site, is that the first site inspection on a site generally?
No, Well, it depends. If there's plumbing and electrical work, we usually have underground plumbing
Okay,
and
I'm
electrical.
including that with the forms usually. So,
Okay, yeah.
but literally, I can start with a demo. I can do my grading. I can dig my trenches. I can do my plumbing. I can run anything else that I have to run through the slab or wherever, and do my forms. And at that point is the first time we actually visit the property for an inspection, right?
I would need to check. There is a rough grading inspection, but I think you're right. I think we could have those combined together all prior to foundation pour.
Okay.
Mhm.
And then when you were describing this this survey option that would go out and do a digital review before and then a digital review after. So walk me through that one too. I just want to know the consequences of that consideration. So I'd be free to do my demolition, free to do my grading. Somebody would have come out before that. Somebody would come out at the end of that. And if they found that I either was off in my calculations or fudged my calculations, then the project would stop and it would have to go apply to the single family design board process at that time. Is that the remedy?
That could be an outcome, yes.
Well, would
Yeah.
there be a different outcome or the guy could remedy his grading, right?
Yeah, well, this is the problem, is that it's just going to give you before grading and a rough grade or finished grade elevation. So if they're over 50 with that, you know that they moved more than 50 cubic yards or whatever the limit was for being exempt. And then they would have to, we'd stop the project and send them back in and say, you've got to go through design review because you've tripped the 50 cubic yard threshold.
And it doesn't sound like any more fun than all the other choices. And then, I guess I just want to flat out say it. So I know they're all happening in one place, which is just a district, but is our belief there that we've seen an abuse of the process or not?
I don't see a regular abuse of the process. I see and I hear licensed engineers and surveyors telling me that they were bringing it as close to the limit as possible in order to make the project work. And that in doing so, and then this whole rubble haul off piece, and there is no verification other than the civil engineer's letter at the end of the project. That leaves the neighbors wondering why we're 7 roll-offs leaving the property, 10 yards each, and you're telling me that they didn't trip a 50 cubic yard threshold. So it just creates doubt in the neighbor's mind.
But so do we not have kind of a perception or opinion that that's taking place or has taken place that leads to this, or are we just reacting to doubt?
It depends who you ask. So if you ask me,
Asking you.
I know. Well, if you, because I'll tell you, the neighbors are very adamant. I mean, they're there all day, every day, every night, and they're watching what's going on. We go out periodically. So from our perspective, we trust the contractors, we trust the engineers, and we check and verify as much as we can and we can afford to do. But it'll never replace the eyes of a neighbor who's watching the project the whole time. So so we have to trust. We have 7 inspectors and hundreds and hundreds of permits. I wish we had time to go sit on the job site and watch the grading, but we don't. And so that's
And then when you talk about the what the engineers, the certification they're making, are they not making a certification at the start of the project based on the topography? Aren't they doing some kind of measurement then to say it's less than 50 cubic yards, and then they would do it at the end too based on all the data they saw, but they're already putting their stamp on a set of plans at the start of the project before a scoop of dirt has been moved on that property, right?
Yes.
Okay. And then this thing with Marburg is the first I've ever heard of this. And I love Marburg too. Great Marburg customer. Have no choice in that, but I'm a great Marburg customer. But I guess I just like you are out on sites or you have people that are out on sites, and is not the opportunity to fill up a roll off with dirt and then throw your rubble all over the top of it just a situation for abuse waiting to happen by the time it gets graded by some poor guy driving a Marburg truck?
Yeah, the Marburg verification is a last resort. Help me understand why the neighbors are,
Okay.
seeing something so different than what we've been told.
So it's not a crucial part of the process up till then. Okay.
No, and we can't rely on it for enforcement.
I don't think so either. So, and then all the other chatter that I've seen about revocation of permits. I mean, I think I'm going to ask Mr. Colon to pop on, but is that truly just not, is that truly at some point during a construction project, is that truly just a nuclear option that literally cannot be contemplated unless it's so black and white clear and the ducks are all in a row?
Mr. Colon, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, Councilmember Jordan. I wouldn't say it's always that way. The analysis depends on the chain of events leading up to the point in time when the permit is being considered for revocation, whatever kind of permit it is. Where we've had losses in the local courts have been where we have changed direction repeatedly during a process. So consistency in reviewing these applications is very important. Without commenting specifically on any particular application, if the evidence supports the conclusion that a permit was obtained by fraud, that's something we can use for revocation. But again, many times the course of dealings between the city and project applicants and builders is very complex. There's a lot of back and forth. We've heard about that in the context of plan review. It happens during construction as well. So it's a difficult process to be both a facilitator, helping someone do construction at a fair price, and a regulator trying to enforce the laws in real time. So it's not revocation is a last resort kind of remedy. And to the extent you're characterizing it that way, I would agree.
Okay. And then can either of you remember this type of over this subject in the last at least 6 years while Mr. Stuffler's been here, however long, Mr. Colon, that has been anywhere else in the city to this regard other than this particular area right now? Is it really unique, the level of discourse and the where it seems to be happening potentially, or the perception that it's happening is truly in the last 5 to 10 years only been in this type of area, a hillside district?
I can't speak for Santa Barbara with the exception of the very recent incident where Edison contractors decided to grade a water course immediately adjacent to the city. I would say that in the cities I've worked with hillsides, it's not uncommon to have unlawful or even renegade grading.
Okay. And so I guess the reason I asked that question is that, and I think, Mr. Stuffler, you said there's kind of different criteria in different locations, whether you're flatland or hillside, if we pick a choice to recommend or a set of choices to recommend, can they be targeted only to a location such as where we're seeing the perceived problem right now? If that's a hillside district, whatever that definition would be, it wouldn't have to be a citywide requirement?
Yes, I would. That said, though, I wouldn't, we could check with Ariel, but I don't think we can make it based on a political boundary. We would have to make it based on a topographical attribute like slope.
Which we have already. We have hillside district definitions
Exactly.
in the municipal code. Some of those hillside districts would be elsewhere. There's hillside districts on the Mesa too.
Right.
So it would be, but it sounds like everybody's only heard of this happening in a hillside district and not other places. And so if that was the recommendation, that would not be unworkable from a legal standpoint to just apply it to that type of environment, right? That type of location.
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, what Mr. Stuffler's referring to is that you can amend the uniform codes for climatic, topographical, or geological conditions. Isn't that right, Andrew?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon.
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez. I just want to clarify again that this isn't political boundaries. And if there are to be any delineations, it would be hillside, which is a factually, mathematically defined slope of a side and which exists on the Mesa, exists on the west side, exists in District 5, exists in other districts as well. There are hillside portions throughout the city, and this is not about political district boundaries. And I would really appreciate that we stop emphasizing the politics of a district. It is that it happens to be that the majority of hillside districts that meet that criteria of 14% slope, which is a quantifiable, measurable amount, happens to be in District 4. It's also in District 5, 2, and 3. I just would like to emphasize that.
Thank you for that, Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon. Yes, Councilmember Jordan. Your mic's not on.
If what I'm saying leads someone to feel that I'm emphasizing a particular political district, either you're misunderstanding that or I'm not saying it adequately well. So apologize for that.
Not you, Mr. Jordan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I apologize to Councilmember Sneddon if she thinks that I was emphasizing the politics of the district boundary. That was not my intent. The emphasis was on it has to be topographical, geological, or climatic.
Thank you for the clarification. Madam Clerk, for the sake of time, can you let me know how many public comment we have?
Yes, currently we have 4 individuals who want to speak on this item.
Okay. In that case, I would like to move forward to public comment, please, Madam Clerk.
Okay, the first speaker we have is Alan Gallegos. Alan Gallegos, please unmute your microphone and go ahead.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Great. Chair Gutierrez and participants, why is the community so outspoken and tired? Everything is finally coming to a head, and you need to seize this opportunity. I fully support George's exit. I have over 20 years of experience in change management and process improvement within a medical device sector. And I know that in order to make real substantial changes within a highly regulated department, the rest of management will need to step aside and allow change to happen. The community is up in arms. Half of them want simple and easy permit process, and the other half want protections in place for scofflaw builders. Andrew's grading ordinance recommendations, in my opinion, miss the mark. Specifically to grading, it should be noted that site inspections can be refused. So it is even more difficult to monitor projects that may become high priority cases in the future. It should also be noted that it is prevalent method for earth removal, where earth is commonly dumped at private sites and reused by other builders, so there is no records or accountability in removal. If revocation is not on the table, you will fail at improving these processes for the greater good. The solution is simple for grading and for other scofflaw activities. We need penalties that result in reducing the number of scofflaw applicants, and then we can be able to create a simpler permit process for all applicants. Penalties that are preventative are the foundation that will allow us to provide solutions to both provide an easier process and protections. We are asking that the building department immediately practice this new favor and utilize the existing revocation ordinance and revoke 2 permits on 2919 and 2924 Ariba Way. This will require no additional action. We just need Andrew Stuffler to set up a meeting with the city's attorney's office and the city administrator and announce his intent and gain guidance on how to proceed. Andrew may be correct that across the board, people may not be admitting to intentional abuse of the laws and ordinances, but let me remind you that this scofflaw builder has a criminal case levied against him by the city attorney's office, with 14 criminal counts, including illegal grading and building code violations across 2 simultaneous permits. Denny Way's evidence was provided by the building department, so they are well aware of the actions of the scofflaw builder. Drawing the line here will set a precedent that will protect our community from undue risk created by scofflaw builders and open the door to simplified building processes and procedures. Take action and demonstrate we have the will to transform our building process. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Gallegos.
Our next speaker is Kenneth Farrell. Kenneth Farrell, please unmute your mic and go ahead.
Guys, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, awesome. So thank you, Mr. Chair. Hi, Mr. Stuffler and council members. So I was on a call earlier with Mr. Stuffler, and I'm a member of the Skyladder Drones organization. I also live in the hillside community and just went through a remodel, so I have a pretty good sense of what all of it, what details are involved. As I listened to the conversation, there seemed to be a perception that there's only a before and after conversation, before and after option for take a picture before, take a picture after. And I just wanted everyone to know that there's a number of different options. A drone can go over and take a map, topographical map before construction starts. It can fly every week. It can fly every other day. So I just want to make sure that there's a lot more options than just before and after. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Michael Corrigan. Michael Corrigan, please unmute your mic and go ahead. Michael Corrigan. Okay, our next speaker is Gil Berry. Gil Berry, unmute your mic and please go ahead.
This is Gil Berry. As an architect of 45 years, I've done 450 projects in the South Coast. I've hired surveyors over 100 times, and I never got one for $2,500, as Andrew said. It's always like $5,000, and then when I have them come out a second time, it's like $2,000. So I don't know who that surveyor was, but it's not a typical surveyor. You can just double that number by 2. And 50 cubic yards is actually a very tiny amount, even on a hillside. It's almost nothing. 50 cubic yards is 21 feet by 21 feet by 3 feet high. When it's blended in, you don't even notice it. The problem is the people that lie and maybe do a couple hundred yards and put down 50. Massive grading is when you have 500 or 1,000 yards. When you have grading problems is when you have 500 or 1,000 yards. 50 cubic yards of grading or less is nothing, even on a hillside. It's not a problem. Maybe we've had 5 problems out of 1,000 people that do grading under 50 yards. Is it fair or reasonable to have 1,000 people pay $5,000 each just because 5 people cheat? That doesn't make any sense. A typical small project could be $100,000. Why should they have to pay $5,000 each just to have a digital survey before and after? You need to trust the professional who did the grading plan. Now, a good solution to this would be to actually require a grading and drainage plan if the grading's under 50 yards, but you don't need to have a digital survey before and after costing thousands of dollars. Also, I believe many of the Hillside District rules apply when you have 20%, not 14% or 15%. It's 20% for a lot of the grading Hillside rules. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for that. Is
Chair
there
Gutierrez, there is no further commenters on this item.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Clerk. All right, now I'd like to open it up to my colleagues for further discussion. Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez. So again, I have my impression of the reason why this has come up so much in the last few years in the Hillside District is because of ADUs. Once we incentivized ADUs, which is an excellent housing option, it's needed to fill our housing gap. The Hillside became an area where many new projects in ADU construction stepped up. And that's most of these projects that are problematic and are causing these issues are ADUs in the Hillside District. I would like ADUs to be able to be built in the Hillside District. I would like for there not to be scofflaws about this 50 cubic yards. I agree that the 50 cubic yard threshold, it's fine. It's not an egregious amount, but the problem is in when it's not being truthfully presented as the amount being removed. And I think this happens with however it is with this accounting of the 50 cubic yards. So I just want to first address why it is such an issue right now. And these 4 projects or ADU projects happen to be, or not all of them actually, but this isn't about 4 particular projects. I want to really emphasize that. And it's not about a particular district. It's about the process where, and this has happened on the Mesa as well, the process where if there are changes, if people do suspect that more is being removed, there isn't a process for review for either revocation of a permit or for single family design review. And I think either of those, if they were actually done, would be effective deterrent. I think that would be more of a deterrent than a fee or a fine. I think it would be more of a deterrent than changing the ordinance, but that if there really was a dispute about the 50, that we don't accept that you can come in with an estimate of 49.5 and call it good. And I guess that's, I'm not sure, I would like to discuss it further and what the actual fix for that issue is. And as soon as we start back up, right now we have a pause on ADUs in the high fire while we're working out our wildland fire protection plans and looking at the roads. But as soon as those are opened back up, this is going to be a continual issue. And it's frankly, one of my biggest issues with ADUs in the Hillside high fire is this grading issue. So I'm looking to my colleagues as well for if these would be satisfactory changes. And I think it only needs to be applied to the definition of hillside, where you have those steep grades. That's where those changes would make the most impact to neighbors on either side. I do think when there's been, I guess that's a question too, when there's been really egregious overstep of the 50 cubic yards, and then it gets kicked to single family design. Is that correct? So the issue is, what do you do when there's a dispute about it, and how do you resolve whether 50 cubic yards has actually been excavation material or rubble or what the definition of that dirt is. And I don't think it's fair to ask Marburg to quantify it. And I don't think we have to have every single property in town doing a before and after. So I guess in discussion, I'm looking to the colleagues here on the Ordinance Committee to see what your thoughts are.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon. My concern about the digital survey of the site before and after is when Mr. Steffler, when you say that it's going to be basically a photograph before and after the project is done, my concern is that we're dealing with a two-dimensional medium. There's no depth of a photograph unless you have like a 3D scanning of the area. So it's kind of hard to determine how much of the earth was removed. So I'm a little wary about having that. I don't know if you'd be willing to either the definition of a digital survey could be something like a 3D mapping of the site, or is it just a regular two-dimensional flat picture?
Chair Gutierrez, yeah, the digital survey is just that. It is survey quality, three-dimensional data that's acquired from a drone. So it uses special technology to determine, based on a big cloud of points that it takes, makes record of in several locations. It triangulates, and then it can reproduce a graph, a three-dimensional graph showing the topography. And I think one of the public comment people wanted to, noted that before and after is an option, but there's also the option of periodic in between. It's just trying to determine what's the frequency, because it would be necessary, and then there's a cost associated with that. So, but just know that it is a 3D set of data that does bring you a topographical map when you're done.
Thank you. Thank you for reiterating that. I appreciate it. Councilmember Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Steffler, could you come back on? So did I hear the public speaker say that there's no grading and runoff plan required on hillside development if you say that you're going to be under the cubic foot limit? Is that true? Or did I misunderstand that?
No, that's not true. There's no requirement for a grading permit to be part of your building permit.
Okay,
or to obtain
but there is a plan.
Well, you cannot violate the grading ordinance. There may not be a plan because there may not be a permit. If the permit's for a building, then there will be a site plan, and we will see drainage because that's part of a building site plan. That's part of the criteria.
But you see that before or after the grading?
Well, we would see that during plan review for a new building, right?
Okay.
They would show us the site. They'd show us the site, a depiction of the site in 2 dimensions with topography on it, and then they would show us where the building's going and the site after finished grade with topography to show how the site drainage is being managed.
And the engineer who lends his stamp to that is doing that 3-dimensional site projections on what dirt was there and then what dirt won't be there, and that's how he's doing his math, right?
Yep, he or she does it that way.
Okay, sorry. So I'm pretty torn on mucking the system up more, or with a greater burden, or how to fix it with what's in place right now. I think I kind of like the overall premise of more input frequently from more people during the grading process, but I'm just not certain that that also isn't as burdensome or more burdensome than just paying for 2 instances of a survey drone to come out and show the before and after too, and either stop it at that time to go to single family design board or bless it and say, move on. Because I can just see that the same situation arises. People who either do or don't have a good perception of what's being hauled away, and the amount of it would then be given opportunities during the process to also muck it up, as I say, I'd like to, by more burdensome regulations. So I'm not really sure what to do with this. The survey, the digital survey with a drone intrigues me. I can tell you that from experience that that's not an obscene amount of money to spend on a project. It's certainly not at all if you're doing 2 stories up in a hillside area, because then you're still talking about structurals, you're still talking about soils report, and it just seems like almost an inconsequential part of a remedy to answer the question. Everything else I see still puts us at the tail end of the work done and being in the same type of enforcement decision as we are now at the tail end of the work being further done on whether to chase this down a revocation rabbit hole or just do our best to ascertain that the guidelines or the obligations for soil being removed were not exceeded. So I'm going to punt it right back to both of you and continue to see what else you have to say here. I could go either way on this. I could go on doing nothing and just continuing to do our due diligence. And I could go on putting a pre and post grading inspection in to resolve that in a hillside district. So it's kind of where I sit right now, on the fence.
Thank you, man. Thank you, Councilman Jordan. Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon.
Thank you. So this came out of response because there were issues. So I'm not comfortable with status quo with no other changes. And Mr. Stuffler, you mentioned that if we wanted you to come back with maybe enforcement options or different ways. I mean, so just assume 50 cubic yards is reasonable. Assume that we can't just eyeball a hillside and say, yeah, that looks about 50 cubic yards. I have some questions on what would be suggestions for how to address this issue with, if part of the rollway is rubble, then it's all counted as rubble. That's one question I have, how to address that issue. And maybe that's where the effort needs to be. Also, if someone has, say, a retaining structure that wasn't permitted in the first place, I mean, I know many people, neighbors, put in little mini retaining walls and structures, and it's all into the 50. But then when it comes time to construct something new, if that's hauled away, then that's called rubble. I mean, it seems to me that the really big issue here is the distinction between how you enforce the difference between rubble and grading material. But I'm open to whatever your suggestions are. But so say we leave it at the 50 cubic yards, and the thresholds are fine for it to go to a single family design. How do we get around this sort of, it's prevalent, it's more than the 4 situations where people submit plans that say 49.5 cubic yards. And I think we all know that the variability on that is, you really can't get it that precise. So how do we handle that particular issue where the grading's already done, it's already been poured, we're already moving on, and then it's but wait, there was more that was left. If you could speak to that.
Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon, Chair Gutierrez, this is why I focus on the how do we quantify the terrain before the project starts. We have a digital map that's created from a flyover that's done every, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 years here. It uses a LiDAR, which is like a light means to bounce light off the earth and determine the grade. And it's great, it's great, but it's only accurate to the nearest 6 inches for the version that we got. That isn't enough of a baseline on larger parcels, because 6 inches of grading, plus or minus 6, is a foot, And that you chew up, 10, 20 cubic yards pretty quick, just with the error factor in our data. That's what led me to look at the, digital surveys that are more cost effective. I think Gil Berry was right on. I mean, to have someone come out with a rod and a stick and shoot, a rod and a level and shoot grade as a surveyor is expensive, especially in the hillside area. So there's some efficiency, that can be gained by using the technology of a drone, but it comes with a cost. But that would give us, if someone did that at the beginning, and I'm not trying to sell this, it's just
I asked the question.
like the best solution,
yeah.
right? If we can get a good baseline set of data during plan check and it's digital and we've got it and it's accurate, and then there's complaints from the neighbors. The ordinance right now lets me prescribe, hey, you need to, builder, you need to go do another survey because we're getting reports that you've graded more than you said you did on your plan. And we went out and looked and it looks questionable. I can require that in the ordinance as it's written now. I can't specifically require a digital survey, but I can require a survey that could be digital, and get that. Now I have a baseline that I can measure to because I got the baseline submitted. And it wasn't just a topographical map on a piece of paper during plan check.
If I might, Chair Gutierrez, Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon, Mr. Stuffler, I wanted to add that from our standpoint, having the baseline data at the outset to compare the finished product against is crucial for evidence in any kind of case that we have. So if in the end our goal is accountability in the hillside areas because of the special health and safety conditions there, it is a special situation that frankly may be more expensive to develop than in the flatter areas of town. So I don't see that honestly as a city requirement so much as a response to the topography that makes unlawful grading all the more risky to the community.
Thank you, Mr. Galong. Mr. Jordan?
Well, that kind of pushes me off the fence then. So I'm in favor of some method of early baseline data before the grading starts, and then either a requirement at a point in time where the grading is over that we get another one, or the other one occurs as a result of input from the community who says they perceive that something's going wrong there. Either one of those I'd be open to, but I can't say that what I just heard was a clear call that it positions us better, it protects the community, and it protects the process if we have that baseline data at the beginning. So that is what I'd lean towards.
Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon?
Thank you. So then how would that work? And I'm in favor of this as well. Sometimes even our street file topo maps that are on file don't match the as-built condition of a property before they then add on an ADU. So I think having a new digital survey ahead of time. So how would that work in the permit part of the process, that if you're in the hillside district as defined by, and I'm sure we'll get the official number of 14% slope as we define our hillside, that if you're in a hillside area and you're planning construction, then given the special consideration for this topography, you would have to do a survey even if you were doing under 50 cubic yards. I guess that's where the question is, because when someone turns in a plan and they say, no, we're just going to do 49.5, then that wouldn't trigger the pre-survey. It wouldn't trigger that. So then it would get to above 50 cubic yards and you still wouldn't have that baseline unless we required it of every permit coming through, and that seems onerous.
Councilmember Jordan?
I'm just lurking. I don't know. I don't know a good answer to that because whatever number you pick is the next number to be abused. And maybe staff could pull some data on that. That's not a concern up in the hillside area. And there actually is in any hillside area over historically, and maybe there's a clean break in the 0 to 10s or 0 to 15s, and then the next ones are all in the 40s. And you could move that number down to whatever, 20 or 10 or 15 and relieve them of that obligation, but everything else you would put it upon because maybe there's nobody in the middle. It's tough I don't know how to make that call if you don't know really where the preponderance of cubic yards is falling on the history of projects.
Mr. Cologne?
Thank you, Chair. I would like to suggest that the committee task our office to work with Mr. Stuffler to come back with some options on how we can increase the verifiability of both sub 50 and 50 or over cubic yard grading applications in the hillside areas. I don't think we would need more than maybe 4 to 6 weeks to come back with some proposals. That would enable me also to engage Denny Way and our enforcement staff. The part of the public commentary that is most directly impactful to my office relates to enforcement. Clearly, I have an obligation to help the council come up with a system that's enforceable. And part of our trouble up in the hillside with the cases that have been mentioned has been the pure difficulty of enforcement given the way the facts have been presented. So I have an interest in fixing that.
Thank you, Mr. Cologne. Okay, Madam Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon.
Thank you, Chair. Good chairs. I'd be very in favor of that. Again, my goal here with this is addressing the actual issue of enforcement when there has been more than the 50 cubic yards, but it's been masked as rubble or masked as excavation takeaway. So I think more looking at this in terms of enforcement and what we can do, I think is really addressing the actual issue at hand. And I do think when we do move towards ADUs again, it will be really good to have this in place ahead of time. And so I don't see this as a rush, something that has to happen in the next 6 weeks, but I think I would favor that option of directing the city attorney's office to come back with options after having worked with Mr. Stuffler and enforcement staff to see what else we can do to quantify that 50 cubic yards in a fair and enforceable way.
Mr. Councilmember Jordan.
Yeah, everything's backwards on my screen. So I agree with that. And the 2 cents I would have to add to that is it's really clear to me that the later we catch the problem, the more reluctant or the worse position we are in to fix it. Like, after a house is built, what are we gonna do? Or after all the foundations are laid, what are we gonna do? So again, I agree exactly with what Councilmember Sneddon said, with the emphasis being on putting us in a position to catch those at an early stage where the damage hasn't been done that can't be undone. That's my goal. I'm in favor of everything else.
Thank you, Councilmember Jordan. I agree as well with our recommendation that Mr. Cologne suggested. So would one of us like to make a motion? Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon.
Thank you, Chair. Good chairs. I'd be happy to make a motion to direct the city attorney's office to come back to this committee with options that involve enforcement and quantifying of the amount of material allowable in the hillside district.
Okay.
I'll
Councilmember-
second.
Thank you. I would like the motion to be read back to us, please, Madam Clerk, for a vote.
Okay, moved by Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon, second by Councilmember Jordan, directing the city's attorney's office to work with community development, Andrew Steffler, with enforcement options to include quantify options that will later come back to Ordinance Committee. We currently have a placeholder on for August 18th. I don't know if that's a date that they can come back by that time, but we do have a placeholder on for that date.
That sounds good to me.
I think we can do that if Mr. Stuffler is not going out of town or anything.
Yes, I think we can do that.
Okay, thank you. I believe we're ready for a vote now.
Councilmember Jordan,
Aye.
Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon,
Yes.
Chair Gutierrez.
Aye.
Okay, that's unanimous.
Thank you.
Okay, and with that, I adjourn this meeting. Thank you.